Second Punic Wars. A war that would last around 17 years, seeing several changes in territory and numerous varied figures involving the likes of the notorious Scipio, Africanus, Hannibal, Hasdrubal, and Mago Barca, and others. It would see two large empires of the Western Mediterranean in the form of Carthage and Rome come to odds. But what had started it? Who would be involved, and what were the motivations of the parties? In this audio podcast episode, we will explore this monumental and important chapter in world history and look at some of the sequelae that would come from it. The period prior to the wars, the embers of the First Punic Wars. It would be marked by the Roman Republic increasing its territory in southern Italy, and while this was occurring, southern Iberia would become more and more a Carthaginian region, as well as the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, and other locations. Two powers at peace with each other for the most part, in Carthage and in Rome, were increasing their control of the region, and several situations would call for their cooperation. But in 264 BC, something would occur that would change that, and the First Punic Wars would erupt. A conflict that would pit two regional superpowers and set them on course for a set of wars. The First Punic Wars would occur from 264 to 241 BC. And one party would emerge victorious at the end of them. The wars brought with them major territorial shifts. By the end of it, Rome would increase its power in the Western Mediterranean. Events during the wars would also set up Roman maritime success for the centuries that followed. The wars wouldn't be limited to one continent and would involve several individuals in a battle that would go down in history as one of the significant wars of the era. Prior to the First Punic Wars, the Roman Republic had been increasing their territory. Carthage would be another regional power, with great commercial strength. Previous years had seen the two powers at numerous times aid each other, including during the Pyrrhic War. Things would come to head in 289 BC when Mamertines took Messana. The Mamertines would seek aid which Carthage would eventually send, and a series of events would eventually lead to the start of hostilities between Carthage and Rome, including the arrival of troops within the region and the defection to the Roman side of Syracuse, as well as events that would see the involvement of a man called Hiero. 264 BC would see the starts of the war. Syracuse at a point in time would find itself under siege. About 2 years later, the Battle of Agrigentum would occur, leading to a Carthaginian defeat. 263 BC, sending of Roman consuls with forces to Sicily. At some point in the intervening time, Syracuse would be put to siege. Syracuse would surrender, and Syracuse would become an ally of Rome. Factors would force the Romans to forage for their food. During this, they are attacked by the Carthaginians. This chapter would see the involvement of Hannibal Gisco. The Carthaginian army, which Hanno would lead, would be made of numerous individuals with various origins, amongst whom were the Celts and the Iberians. Hanno is the son of Hannibal. Hanno, son of Hannibal, with the army marches to the rescue of Agrigentum, attacking months after his arrival in the region. Battle of Agrigentum in 262 BC occurs. A battle between the two powerful and influential states of Carthage and Rome. It would see individuals the likes of Lucius Postumius Megellus, Hanno, and Hannibal Gisco participate in it and play some varied roles. It would involve several interesting events. Included within it was a siege. It would also see the defeat of Carthaginian forces, some of whom would be able to escape. Possessions would be added to Rome, which it could put to good use. In addition to this, a new position was also added to it. The event had seen the involvement of forces under Roman consuls. Agrigentum's geography made it a position that was easier to defend. Included in this were rivers and slopes that were a part of its inherent topography. Possession of Messana by the Carthaginians would have an impact on the state of affairs at the time, giving them advantages that they could wield in order to gain the territory of Sicily and hamper the interests of one of its adversaries in the form of Syracuse. Syracuse's defect to Rome after the defeat of forces that belonged to Carthage and Syracuse, and the hiring of mercenaries by the Carthaginians, would be some of the numerous events that would follow. In addition to which would be the increasing importance with which Agrigentum would be seen by Carthage. Added to this was how it would become an important and central base for them, and would continue to be important in some of their affairs. Things would increasingly move towards a conflict between those in Agrigentum and the Romans. Large troops were coalescing around Agrigentum. More individuals would arrive within the walls of the city as they were relocated into it. Amongst the forces from Rome would be forces under the consuls Lucius Postumius Megellus and Quintus Mamilius Vitulus. The Romans would find themselves pounced upon at some point by Hannibal as they harvested crops. Rome lost several of its men in the events that followed. The events of the attack would give both sides information that would guide their future actions, and some changes and events would occur following it, as well as changes in the approach to events that had been unfolding. Several months later, Agrigentum would find itself with a reducing stock to feed its population, and given the developments that had arisen and the new situation they would find themselves in, they would be forced to send for assistance from Carthage. Aid, which would ultimately be sent in the form of forces. Hanno would occupy an important role in this relief force. Several positions would be of importance, including Heraclea Manoa, Tauros, and a supply base at Urbissos. Clashes between these forces and the Romans would occur, with the Romans at times losing men and troops and being cut off from critical supplies in a series of clashes. Several factors would be involved in the timing of the conflicts, and when each side would decide to clash with the other, at times conflict would be avoided. Eventually, a clash would occur between the powers, which would see fierce and protracted fighting and would see the Carthaginians emerge as the beaten parties. During this general period, Rome would also face conflicts with Corsica and Sardinia. 260 BC would see the building of ships by the Romans. It also would see Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio arriving in Lipari Island, his target being Lipara, and a counter by the Carthaginians who dispatched ships to the island under a man called Boodes. The Battle of Lipari Islands would occur. Battle of Lipari Islands. Prior to the events at the Battle of Lipari Islands, the conflicts between Rome and Carthage had been going on, and several battles had occurred before, including the notable Battle of Agrigentum, which had seen the involvement of individuals like Hanno, Hannibal, and forces under the consuls. In contest was Syracuse, and several clashes between the Romans and Carthaginians would arise. A naval battle would occur in the form of the Battle of Lipari Islands. Experience was on the side of Carthage, a nation more accustomed to naval warfare. In the past, when Rome had need for any naval assistance, they had leaned on their allies in the form of the Greeks and the Latins for some of that support. But now they had taken the opportunity to develop their own expertise and abilities, and therefore build their own ships, but they still faced limitations that they had, and near-instant results would not be a reality for the Romans. The Battle of Lipari Islands transpired in 260 BC and would conclude in victory for the Carthaginians, which up to that point in time had been the more dominant naval authority between the two powers, Carthage and Rome. It consequentially also resulted in not only defeat for the Romans but also saw the capture of Scipio, the Roman consul who had been tempted into moving towards Lipara, even though his fleet had several limitations. The event would see the involvement of individuals the likes of Hannibal Gisco, who had been involved in proceedings at Agrigentum and had been able to escape. Boodes and Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Asana were also be involved. As was stated before, the Carthaginians were the dominant naval authority up to this point, but before the events at Lipari, something had occurred that would set the pace for a coming change in the trend. The Romans would gain access to a Carthaginian ship and would study it in order to be able to make their own ships. A process that would fail to yield immediate results but would eventually pay off in the long term. Several factors would come into how a dominant naval authority remained dominant beyond the ship's quality. Included in the other aspects that had to be considered was the ability to handle those ships and the changes that had to be made in the way that one battled at sea. In addition to this, the makings of a ship could determine how one chose to fight, and several changes had occurred in naval warfare. After the events at Lipari, and after others, the Romans would come to add the corvus to their ships. It would take time to train a crew in the ways of operating a ship. This would factor into why it was so easy for the Carthaginians, amongst whom was Boodes who had been sent by Hannibal Gisco, to overcome the Romans, and why events would unfold as they did with the outcomes that arose from the conflicts between the Carthaginian and Roman fleets. The Battle of Mylae would also occur during this time with Gaius Duilius at the helm. Some events would occur not necessarily in 259 BC. After the events in the Battle of Agrigentum, Rome would go on to Mytistratin, and then Thermae. Hamilcar launched attacks. At sea, Lucius Cornelis Scipio would be able to capture Illyria, but would face resistance when he tried to attack Olbia. 258 BC, Rome retakes Enna and captures Mytistratin, Hippina, and Camarina. During that time, the Romans won the Battle of Sosi, which would be between Roman and Carthaginian fleets. The general period would see a greater shift of the war from the theater of land battle to one that included the sea. 256 BC would see the departure of a Roman fleet from Ostia. In its crosshairs would be Carthage. The Carthaginians would, however, not be ignorant of the threat and would be able to respond to its growing size. The Battle of Cape Ecnomus would also occur. 256 BC would see a battle that would end in a Carthaginian loss and would involve personalities the likes of Marcus Attilius Regulus on the Roman side and Hanno and Hamilcar on the Carthaginian side. It would see the contribution of several ships, some of which would be sunk by the termination of the conflicts amidst fierce naval fighting that had occurred. It would also see extensive and large numbers of forces come head-to-head in a battle that would be noted down in history. The fleet on the Carthaginian side was trying to defend its homeland from the invading fleet of the Romans who had Carthage as their target. It followed several events like the Battle of Mylae, which had seen the victory of the Romans in an encounter with the Carthaginian fleet under individuals like Hannibal Gisco. A victory which had seen the participation of the Corvus, and one in which the Carthaginians had been made to retreat having lost numerous of their ships. It also followed events like the Battle of Agrigentum, which had occurred in the year 262 BC. An epic battle that would occur between forces from the two powerful and influential powers of Carthage and Rome. It had seen people the likes of Lucius Postumius Megellus, Hanno, and Hannibal Gisco. It had also involved several interesting events, and would see the defeat of Carthaginian forces, some of whom would be able to escape. Possessions would be added to Rome. Back to the Battle of Cape Ecnomus. With time, the conflicts would involve more people and more regions, and the theater where the war would occur would change with time. Several changes would also occur in naval warfare as well, including the introduction of the corvus on the Roman side, a contraption which would have a massive effect on the course of naval battles between the two powers. Some naval events would occur preceding the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, including the battles of Sosi and the Battle of Mylae. Prior to the events that would occur at Cape Ecnomus, the fleet of the Carthaginians would pass through several points, amongst which were Heraclea Manoa. The Carthaginian fleet would be large and consist of several ships. Hanno and Hamilcar would play prominent roles within the Carthaginian fleet. The Roman side would see the involvement of the consuls Marcus Attilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Voso Longus, and would be made of a large number of ships as well, that would rival those that had been gathered by the Carthaginians. Both fleets transporting large numbers of forces and a large population who would play different roles, some of them ready for battle on land and some for battle at sea. Battle was brewing, and a battle that would see the defeat of the Carthaginian fleet in an event that would be remembered in history. Numerous events would occur after the events at the Battle of Cape Ecnomus. For one, the Romans would ultimately find themselves landing in Africa, their initial goal, where they could go on to attack Carthage. Secondly, the Carthaginians that had been spared in the fighting would retreat, recovering as they readied themselves for what would follow. Back to the battle. The Roman fleet would assume formation, and the Carthaginian fleet would do much the same. Hamilcar and Hanno would be present. The fighting and maneuvering would involve a feint on the part of the Carthaginians, which would draw some of the Roman ships in their direction. The Carthaginians would use this to their advantage. The fighting would go on and would occur via several fronts, with the forces having been split. In the fighting, numerous ships would be lost on either side as the fighting went on. At some point in time, the Carthaginian center would be forced into a retreat. Many ships on the Carthaginian side would be lost in the fighting that took place after. At the conclusion of it, the Carthaginians would lose a lot more than what the Romans had lost. Some of Carthage's ships would be sunk while others would be captured. The events here would be followed by other incidences like the landing in Aspis by the Roman army and the Roman siege on the city of Idis. A surprise attack by a Carthaginian force would also occur. It saw individuals like Hamilcar and Hasdrubal involved. Tunis would be captured by the Romans, and Carthage would seek peace, but Regulus would give harsh terms, so war would continue and would see several prominent events. Xanthippus would lead a force against the Romans and win at the Battle of Tunis. 255 BC, Battle of Tunis. Calamity and loss would strike the Romans as they lost ships and men in a storm. 254 BC, recapturing of Agrigentum by the Carthaginians, attack of Panermus by the Romans. Lades, Celis, Petra, Tyndaris would eventually be under Rome's influence. Loss of ships by the Romans in a storm again, 252 BC. Lilybaeum has a naval expedition sent towards it by the Romans. Selinus and Heraclea Manoa are captured. Thermae and Lipara are also captured. 250 BC, effort at capturing Panermus by the Carthaginians. The Romans are foraging for food when they are attacked. Commander Lucius Caecilius Metellus would play a significant role in the counterattack. The Carthaginian attack would involve elephants whose use would be limited by tactics the Romans used. The conflict at Parnomus would therefore go down as a Roman victory, 249 BC. Roman consuls for that year being Lucius Junius Pullus and Publius Claudius Pulcher, the father of Appius Claudius Pulcher. Lilybaeum is put to siege by the Romans, but the Carthaginians are able to supply and support the city. Surprise attack on the Carthaginian fleet is attempted but fails. Also in 249 BC, Roman defeat at Battle of Drepana. General period would see major sieges by the Romans on the Carthaginians. By the end, the financial state that both powers were in was pitiful, and the war had cost them many resources. Lilybaeum and Drepana were however still held by Carthage, and Rome would build a new fleet, launching an attack which would eventually prove successful against Carthage and result in the Battle of Aegiates Island. The fleet from the Romans had been funded by the wealthy individuals of Rome. 241 BC, Battle of Aegiates Island. The Treaty of Lutatius would follow, as well as the end of the war, with Carthage having conditions they had to meet which involved issues around territory and other things. The war would affect several regions, several individuals, and include several iconic conflicts. Both sides would endure massive losses, including losses in forces, ships, and resources, at the termination of which Rome would emerge the victorious party. Demands were made of Carthage under the Treaty of Lutatius, including territorial changes. Important Sicilian territory would be included in the territory that Carthage had to cede. The truceless war would involve the mutiny of troops used by the Carthaginians. It would take place in 241 BC and end about 3 to 4 years later. It ended with Carthage's victory when Carthage intervened and brought the revolt down, and also led to some changes in territory. What had started the war? Money, or better stated, it was the result of Carthage failing to pay soldiers who had fought in the first Punic Wars for them. It would see the involvement of individuals like Spendius and Motto. When fighting erupted, the soldiers would be joined by others, particularly Africans who had their own disputes with Carthage. They in turn would add to the collective resources in the fight against Carthage. Carthage, reeling from the defeat from the First Punic War, would be still in a weak state. In the early parts, the conflict would go the way of the rebels. At some point, Hamilcar Barca would gain joint command of the army and continue the fight. 237 BC would see the defeat of the rebels. However, Carthage would be stopped from taking back territory which had been occupied by the rebels in Sardinia by the Romans, as they stated such action would equate to war. Hamilcar, who had led the Carthaginian land forces from 247 BC in Sicily, moved to establish a presence in southern and eastern Iberia, which added to the resources of Carthage in several important respects. Added to the resources was the population and wealth that came from such a region. He was father to Hannibal, Hasdrubal, and Mago Barca. The army that he would build would be constituted of Africans, Iberians, Numidians, and others. The Ebro Treaty would be seen in 226 BC. It identified some of the boundaries that Hasdrubal and Rome would use. The river Ebro would be an important boundary. Rome was not to go further south of it, and Carthage further north. It would be relevant when the issue of Saguntum would arise. Saguntum would be a town found south of Ebro, so that when Rome became affiliated with it, it gave the Carthaginians cause to attack the town. When the Romans complained about the attack on its ally, they would demand that Carthage hand over Hannibal as they demanded Carthage hand over anyone involved in the attacks. The path for war had been set. 219 BC would see Saguntum placed under siege by Hannibal. 218 BC would see war declared, after envoys had been sent following the issue of Saguntum. The Second Punic War would begin in 218 BC and would find itself ending in 201 BC with Roman victory. At stake would be dominance within the region, and with it, more territory. Other states would also be involved in the fighting, and the wars would occur in different locations and climates. Amongst the areas that would witness some of the conflicts would be Sicily, Greece, Iberia, and others. Starting with the year 219 BC, in the city of Saguntum, which would see the notorious Hannibal capture the city after having laid it to siege. War would be declared soon after in 218 BC by Rome, thus the flames of war would be ignited and the flames would spread widely. 218 BC would see Hannibal, the Carthaginian general and leader, son of Hamilcar, and his troops journey to Cisalpine Gaul. They would pass through several regions, overcoming several challenges. Amongst those challenges were the local inhabitants and a difficult terrain. He would be able to overcome several of the enemies he met on the battlefield, a testament to his acumen in military affairs. He would go on to have many other triumphs like the Battle of Trebia and the Battle of Cannae. Cisalpine Gaul, a region with a rich history, is now northern Italy. Later on in history, it would be considered as a constituent of Roman Italy. And in the years after the First Punic Wars, Rome would expand in this region, setting up for conflicts with the local Gaul population as they tried to set up towns. These and other actions would create negative emotions in the local tribes, setting up the context for events that would happen in the Second Punic Wars. The year 218 BC would also see the Battle of Ticinus occur and saw victory for the Carthaginians. It would be fought and see the involvement of Publius Cornelius Scipio, who was one of the consuls in that year. He and his army would come to a conflict with Hannibal and his army. Publius Cornelius Scipio would be the father of Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, who would have a prominent role in the Second Punic Wars. The battle would see Scipio organize his army, but in the course of the battle, he would be injured, forcing him to be saved by his son. He and his forces would retreat, his rearguard being captured as they did, and he would wait for reinforcements who would arrive later that year, setting up the Battle of Trebia. Hannibal would stay over in winter. The year would also see the Battle of Trebia, which occurred in December between a Roman army led by Sempronius and Carthage. Tiberius Sempronius Longus was the other consul, and had been able to wrestle Malta from the Carthagins before he had been redirected by the Roman Senate on hearing of Scipio's defeat at the Battle of Ticinus. Defeat would be convincing in its outcome for the Romans. With Scipio still healing and recovering from his wounds, Sempronius would be tasked with leading the troops. With the victory came an expansion in the troops under Hannibal by thousands, as some Gallic individuals would join them. Many casualties would also be endured. Several troops would be captured. Malta was captured by Rome, as has been mentioned before. The conflict involved would involve Sempronius Longus and Hamilcar, who was the son of Gisco. It was after the Battle of Lilybaeum, which had seen the involvement of the praetor Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, and would see the Carthaginian ships routed and several of their ships captured. The year would also see Roman colonies attacked by Gallic tribes in Cisalpine Gaul. They escaped to Messina. Messina would be held to siege at some point in the year, a siege which was implemented by the Gauls. The siege would resist and attempt to break it. The Gauls would, however, eventually retreat from Messina. Battle of Rome Crossing occurs. It ends in victory for the Carthaginians. It saw a conflict between Carthage and Gallic Volcae. What happened during the conflict would be that Hanno, the son of Hamilcar, would be sent with a force to position themselves behind the Gauls so that when Hannibal faced them, they would have to face an attack coming from behind them as well. Setting up of a northeast Iberia lodgment by the Romans. Battle of Sissa also occurs in 218 BC and saw conflict between the Roman army led by Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus, older brother of Scipio, and a former consul who had been consul in 221, against Carthaginians led by Hanno. The Carthaginians were very much outnumbered by the Roman forces, and Hasdrubal would not arrive to the aid of Hanno until the clash was well over. The battle was a significant loss for the Carthaginians, losing territory and allowing the Romans ground which they could use as a base, limiting the Carthaginians' options further. 217 BC. Apennines crossed by the Carthaginians, a move which would be unanticipated by the Romans. Flaminius goes after Hannibal's army. Battle of Lake Trasimene occurs. Roman army is defeated. Flaminius dies, and on the Roman side several casualties arise from the conflict. Some individuals would be captured by the Carthaginians as a result, including Latins who were treated better than the Romans. The battle had involved an ambush. Carthaginians moved further, passing through several regions including Umbria, Apulia, and Etruria. 216 BC. Southern Italy is the location that Hannibal and his forces travels to. Battle of Cannae occurs, which is significant for several reasons, amongst which are the sizes of the armies involved in the battle. The victories of the preceding years would shift the alliances, with several allies shifting camp. For example, Capua, which had formerly been an ally of Rome, would be one of the cities that would now find itself on the Carthaginian side. The conflict would continue growing in terms of breadth and who was involved, as well as the casualties incurred. Several of the parties in the war would find themselves having to act at odds with their usual behavior. For one, Rome would be pressed to add numbers to the army which was losing men, and forced to recruit soldiers widely and sometimes from unexpected sources. 216 BC. New consuls in the form of Gaius Terentius Varro, who had been preceded by Gnaeus Servilius Geminus and Marcus Attilius Regulus, are set in place. Gaius Terentius Varro was the son of a butcher, but would rise in the political world and even play a role in the appointment of Minucius as co-dictator at some point. The other consul of that year would be Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Lucius had been consul before in 219 BC. Both consuls would be present at the Battle of Cannae. Seizing of supply depot by Hannibal. Paulus and Varro and their army meet in a conflict with Hannibal and his army. Battle sees several notable individuals, at the end of which Carthage emerges victorious due to a well-worked strategy. Battle is known as the Battle of Cannae. Lucius Aemilius Paulus would die in this battle. The Battle of Cannae would have massive effects on Rome and would see or result in several changes. Over the period that follows, more cities joined the Carthaginian cause. Some factors would limit the cohesion of Carthage and her allies, however. 215 BC. Lockery defects to Carthage. The defect would aid the Carthaginians, and they would be able to use the city to their benefit. Battle of Dertosa, or Battle of Ibera, would also be fought in 215 BC, and would see the Romans emerge the victorious party at its termination. A large contingent of the Carthaginian force, made up of Iberians, would run away from battle, but Hasdrubal would be able to escape. On the other side would be the Romans led by Gnaeus and Publius Cornelius Scipio, who were brothers. The battle would be important in the course of the wars. Hannibal wouldn't be able to receive the reinforcements from his brother. Death of Hiero II, Hieronymus takes over. Hiero had been an ally of Rome. Treaty between Syracuse and Carthage also occurs at some point in time. 214 BC. First Macedonian War between Rome and Macedon. Philip V of Macedon had allied with Hannibal, and fighting Macedon would keep Macedon occupied for the Romans. Battle of Beneventum between the Roman Republic and Carthage would result in Roman victory. It saw Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus and Hanno involved, and again it would mean Hannibal wouldn't get the reinforcements he was looking for. Rome's army increases as they add several recruits to their numbers. 213 BC. Siege on Syracuse by Rome, which lasts until 212. At the end of it, the Romans would be victorious, but the siege would also see Archimedes dead. The siege would also see Marcus Claudius Marcellus involved. He was proconsul. It would also see the propraetor Appius Claudius Pulcher. The siege also saw several devices used on both sides, like the sambuca on the Roman side. The sambuca was a siege engine that would also find itself in use during the Siege of Chios. 215 had seen the rise of Hieronymus to the throne. His grandfather had been King Hiero II, an ally of Rome. Himilco and his army are sent to respond. Himilco would be a general in the Carthaginian army, and he would be able to gain some territory for the Carthaginians. Arpi is captured by the Romans. Event sees the involvement of the Roman consul Quintus Fabius Maximus. Prior to the battle, the Romans would have gained territory including Aequi, Compsa, Campoteria, and other territories in a phase of war that had changed from the one before it. Elements within the city, seeing the change in fate for the Romans, would offer to aid them. Thus, the city turned to align itself to Rome. A Numidian king called Syphax, who was the king of a tribe in western Numidia, sides with Rome. Syphax would be relevant again in the future. 212 BC. First Battle of Capua, Hannibal would fight the two consuls and their armies, after which the consuls would divide their armies. After this, the Romans would once again attack Capua in the future. Battle of the Silarus occurs. Hannibal emerges victorious. Battle involves a centurion called Marcus Centenius Panella. Significant forces would be lost by the Romans whilst the Carthaginians lost relatively few troops. It followed the Battle of Capua. The Roman consuls separated their troops going in different directions. Hannibal would chase Claudius, one of the consuls. He'd meet the centurion Marcus Centenius Panella, defeat him, and afterwards his pursuit of Claudius would be abandoned. Hannibal moved east. Battle of Herdonia. Hannibal again victorious. It would see Gnaeus Fulvius Flaccus involved. Several Roman troops would be lost. Year also sees Saguntum fall to Roman commanders. 211 BC. Romans attack, but lose several times throughout the year. Siege on Capua. Capua was an ally to the Carthaginians. The siege remains in place despite attempts by Carthage to break it, including a feigned attack on Rome. At a later date, Capua eventually falls. It would see Quintus Fulvius Flaccus and his troops involved, and it followed several attempts by the Romans to capture the city back after it had defected to the Carthaginians. Sicily reinforced by Carthaginian forces. Battle of Upper Baetis, that's made up of the battles of Castello and of Vallorca. It sees Hasdrubal and Mago Barca as well as Publius and Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio. At the end of it, Publius and Gnaeus were dead. In the events before the battle, the Roman forces were divided between the brothers as Mago and Hasdrubal would be located apart from one another. Therefore, Gnaeus would attack Hasdrubal Barca, and his brother Publius would move to attack Mago. Prior to the wars as well, Castello had been captured by the Romans. At the Battle of Castello, Publius Scipio would battle Indibilis and his army. Initially things went well for him, but the army of the Iberians was reinforced by an arriving Massinissa, which was further compounded by the arrival of Mago and Hasdrubal Gisco. Publius wouldn't survive. Whilst at the Battle of Vallorca, Gnaeus Scipio had lost some of his troops as they were bought off by Hasdrubal Barca. He and his forces would be forced on the defensive by the overwhelming force that was arranged against them. The force was comprised of the forces of Hasdrubal Barca, Mago, and Hasdrubal Gisco. Him and his men would be overcome, leaving him dead like his brother. The Carthaginians would make a decision that they might have come to regret in the future. A decision that regarded what they would do with some of the soldiers that still remained alive after the conflicts. 210 BC. Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus comes to Iberia. He is the son of Publius Scipio. He eventually becomes a renowned military genius and continues on to play a substantial role in the Battle of Zama that would come in the future. 209 BC. Battle of New Carthage. It was a battle between a Roman army led by Publius Scipio and a Carthaginian army under Mago. After a day of attacking the Carthaginian city, the Romans would initiate another wave of attacks which was not in keeping with the usual behavior that surrounded attacks on fortifications. Attacks from three directions would occur: south, east, and the west. When Mago moved men that had been on the north wall, the Romans would take advantage, climbing the walls. They would open the east gate. The Romans would be able to enter, sacking the city as they went. Mago would eventually surrender. Among the extensive plunder would be food, ships, and coins. The city's capture would afford the Romans a greater advantage. Battle of Canusium or Asculum would occur in 209 BC as well. It occurred between Hannibal and Marcus Claudius Marcellus. Both sides of the conflict would emerge from the conflict with massive losses. Hannibal would be able to involve himself in another battle involving the fate of the city of Colonia, and battled Roman forces that were near to the city. 208 BC. Battle of Baecula between Hasdrubal and Scipio Africanus. Scipio would emerge victorious from the battle. Prior to the battle, Hasdrubal would move his forces when he heard of the Roman army's approach. The new position would have strong defensive attributes, and when the battle began, Scipio would make a move that would greatly limit the Carthaginians' ability to retreat. He had achieved this by sending forces to certain places and paths. He'd then confront the Carthaginians and eventually attack them on the left and right. Hasdrubal would be able to escape, however, and he did so with some of his troops. 207 BC. The Alps is crossed by Hasdrubal. Battle of the Metaurus, death of Hasdrubal. The Battle of Metaurus would see the consuls Marcus Livius and Gaius Claudius Nero involved. Prior to the battle, Hasdrubal had made considerable progress in his journey to join his brother Hannibal. His journey through the Alps would be different to his brother's years before, as many of the Gauls would join him, instead of offering resistance as they had to his brother. At some point, messengers sent to Hannibal from Hasdrubal would be intercepted by the Romans, and the message they had would come to be in the possession of the Romans. The Romans would thus be forced to counter hastily in order to prevent the brothers from joining forces, which they promptly did. Nero would march a force to meet with that under Marcus Livius. Hasdrubal was now facing an army that was larger than the one he initially thought he would, an army that had grown overnight. This observations he would make from where he was. He would move to retreat, but calamities and poor outcomes would follow his attempt, and he would eventually find himself between a hard place and a rock as he was and forced to fight. He would fight until he could no longer fight, dying in the battle. And with his death, his attempt to reinforce and add to Hannibal's numbers wouldn't succeed as he had planned it to, significantly weakening Hannibal's position. Following Hasdrubal's defeat, Bruttium would be where Hannibal's forces would move towards. 206 BC. Battle of Ilipa, which would be significant in the history of Scipio Africanus. Mago and Hasdrubal Gisco would be together at Ilipa, and for days prior to the battle, conflicts would occur between the Carthaginians and the Romans. Scipio would use these battles to convince the Carthaginians of how he wanted to use and arrange his troops, so that on the day when Scipio arranged his troops in a different way, the Carthaginians would be unable to rearrange theirs as they had already arranged in a way assuming the Roman troops would act as they had before. Their flanks and other parts would eventually be attacked. The battle would have to be delayed by heavy rain. Eventually, Hasdrubal Gisco and Mago would flee, along with some men. Mutiny within the Roman troops, suppressed by Scipio. 205 BC. Mago Barca arrives in Genoa. 204 BC. Several events would occur over this period, amongst which would be the demand by the Carthaginian Senate for the army led by Hannibal to return. 204 BC. Battles of Croton would see battles between the Romans and Carthaginians. Croton was a port which Carthage had retained for years, and it and its surroundings would be a setting for a set of conflicts. The events here had followed several other events like the Battle of the Metaurus River. 203 BC. Battle of Insubria. The battle would occur in the context of a Carthage which was on the back foot amidst growing Roman strength. Mago Barca would be tasked with joining his brother Hannibal. Several forces would be added to him by the Ligurians, and his army would increase with the added troops. Proconsul Cornelius Cethegus and Praetor Quintilius Varus and their forces would go against Mago on the battlefield along with his forces in a battle that would prove to be a back-and-forth affair. It would lead to casualties on both sides, and would also see Mago injured. 202 BC, momentous and war-defining Battle of Zama takes place. It would be seen as an important battle in the Second Punic Wars, with Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus and Hannibal taking center stage in the theater of battle. The Romans would be outnumbered but would still achieve victory against the more numerous Carthaginians. Scipio had been made consul in 205 BC, What would set the scene for the battle? Several things had happened. Hannibal had returned from Italy, a draft treaty had been ratified by the Roman Senate and had been rejected. A battle would eventually ensue that saw fierce conflicts between the Carthaginian and Roman forces, with wave after wave of fighting. Some of the fiercest fighting would occur over the battles, but at their end, the Carthaginians would emerge severely weakened. They would be forced to eventually sign a peace treaty, one that would lead to many concessions of territory and a change in its status. A lot of things would change at the conclusion of these events. Zama would see Hannibal defeated. The terms for peace were numerous, some of them stipulating the way Carthage was to act, determining the reduction in territory and which territory was to be lost. The Third Punic War would start around 149 BC. Thank you for listening to this podcast into the Second Punic Wars. If you enjoyed it, be sure to listen and watch other videos. Also subscribe to the channel and like the video. See you in the next episode.